business card, it says Henny Swan, Director of User Experience at iHenny at the Paciello Group. But in fact, none of that is completely true. My legal name is not Henny Swan. Henny is my nickname, Swan is my maiden name. And while I'm the Director of User Experience, and that is effectively what I do in companies, I find myself doing all sorts of different stuff when I sit down and I work with design teams. I have something of a strategy hat on, a little bit of a design hat, interaction design, user experience design, usability testing, all of that kind of stuff. And while I work for the Paciello Group and they pay my wages, I don't do anything for them. I work with my clients, so I work with different teams, different projects, different organizations, across different industries as well, but all digital. The one theme that is constant throughout, however, is accessibility. So I describe myself as an accessibility hobo. And actually, I feel like I'm in quite a privileged position because when I start working on a project, I might get kind of whistle-stopped in to look at the user experience or do some design reviews or talk to the developers. But what I'm really doing is talking across all the teams and across all the disciplines, because to make a product accessible, it doesn't live with the developers, it doesn't live with the designers, it cuts across everything, which is why I think of myself as a hobo. And I'll get used to this in a minute. And it's a bit like a button. I was thinking, well, what is a kind of a design element that we all have to collaborate on? I mean, obviously it's everything, but a button is a really good example because in my work, it can make or break the accessibility of a page. You know, it's an element of a graphical user interface which a user can select to perform a particular action. We buy stuff with buttons, we submit forms, we look in tab panels, we manipulate carousels, we open and close panels of content, etc. But as I say, it's a simple element used in complex ways requiring cross-team collaboration in order to make it accessible. And what I mean by accessible is ensuring that people with hearing or sight or physical, cognitive, or learning impairments are able to use the button just as much as anybody else can in the room. It also affects people who are aging, and it also affects people who may have a temporary or a situational disability. It kind of affects us all, really. A situational disability might be you're standing outside in the cold and the rain, and your hands are cold, and you're trying to use your smartphone. A temporary disability might be that you've got RSI or you've got a horrible migraine that day, which may affect your ability to interact with that button. So what can and cannot affect a button? So it might be that you look at it and you're like, I don't know what it does. Maybe you've got a cognitive impairment or a learning disability, or you're encountering a button that is presented in an inconsistent way to what you're familiar with, or you don't know what it did. Imagine if you have low vision and you scale everything up in your browser, or you have a platform zoom technology. Maybe you just see a tiny portion of your screen and you hit that button, something has changed, but for you, it's off screen, so you don't know what that button did. Or maybe you can't find it. I've watched people in usability testing going through search results and using filters on the left-hand side to change what they see in their search results. They go down the column, selecting what they want, and they get to the bottom, and they're looking for a button. But they don't know that their preferences have been updated on the page because it's not immediately obvious, so they can't find the button, but there isn't one. Or you can't see it. Again, you might have low vision, or just like me, I wear reading glasses. I don't have them on all the time, especially when I'm using my mobile phone, and I can't always see the outline of the button. Or maybe the contrast is low, or perhaps there's no visible focus state. Maybe you use your keyboard to tab around and find elements on a page. Or perhaps you're a blind user. You can't see what's on screen, but what you use is a screen reader which reads out everything that's on screen. So the button needs to have an accessible name, so it's announced to you as submit button. Or maybe you can't set focus on it. It's been coded in such a way that you're tabbing around the page, but the keyboard tab order skips over the button. So game over. So a button can really make or break our experience on the web. There's a number of ways that we can make that button accessible, and the responsibility doesn't lie with any one person, it lies with a number of people working within the team on that component or on that page. We have what's called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Show of hands, how many people have heard of these? So I'd say most of you have heard of these. How many of you are actively using them in your projects? Probably half of what people put their hands up for, which is interesting. So the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines are there to tell us what to do for our bread and butter to make that button accessible. Fundamental things like color contrast, color and meaning, making sure you don't rely on color alone, visible focus state. So we're thinking about design there, aren't we? And then we're looking at what images to use, text alternatives for the button, so content order, interaction design, focus management. When I hit that button, where does the focus go? Do I know where it goes? Can I track it, whether I can see the screen or not? And roles and state. Is it a button or is it a link? So that's your bread and butter, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. That needs to be baked into your design, your interaction design, your content design process. But actually, to truly make things inclusive, we need to be thinking about the overall user experience for people with disabilities. And we have something called the Inclusive Design Principles. 7 principles which they're not prescriptive, they don't tell you how to design, because I don't think you can tell anyone how to design. Everything changes dependent on the situation, so you need to consider the situation. When it comes to people with disabilities, you want to have an equivalent experience, but it might not always be possible, because at the end of the day, somebody can't see. Watching a movie with audio description isn't going to be the same, but we want to go for comparable experience. We want to be consistent in our design. We want to give people alternative ways to complete complex or non-standard tasks, so offering choice, give control, so buttons that allow you to do something differently, and then prioritizing content. Is that button easy to find? Is it high up in the content order? Is it visually clear? And then adding value. So an adding value type button on a feature might be having a show password button on a login page, because who doesn't struggle with filling in passwords? So we have the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, bread and butter, which show you what to do to make your designs compliant, to ensure you have accessible output. And it very much focuses, at least in my mind, the content guidelines focus on technology. Used just by themselves, we run the risk of forgetting that we're designing these things for people, ourselves included. And I don't want to be described in terms of compliance and output and technology. I'm a person and I experience things in different ways. So we want to go for the inclusive design principles. So we're really thinking about what's the user experience? Can we add value here? Can we provide multiple ways to complete a complex user journey? What's the outcome? The output might be an accessible form, but the outcome might not be successful for somebody who's disabled if that button is too small and you've got bad dexterity problems, or the color contrast is terrible, or it's positioned in a way that you can't find it, it's off screen. So it's very much about people. And this is where we come into role-based accessibility. Everybody has a role to play. Nobody has ultimate responsibility. We all have a role to play. So clearly we have interaction design. What is the role of this button? How does it behave? Where does it take you to? And where does it return you from? We then have user experience and design. Does it make the process easier? Can I see it? Is it clear? Is it obvious what it does? We then have content. What is the editorial of the button? Whether the editorial is visible, a label on the button, or it's invisible to someone who sees, but visible or audible to someone who can't see. But then developers are part of, and I have to pick my words carefully here, developers are also part of the design process. They're part of your design team as well, because you should be working with your developers to understand if the designs you have for your buttons are implementable. Are they practical? Are they going to be able to support standards compliance, pure, good HTML, etc.? And then your users are part of your design team as well. Never should we really design with the users on the other side of the front door. They are the best people to defer to. So let's have a look at this. Interaction design, role and behavior. And I've picked on the whole button and image idea here. Quite often, as designers, we conflate or confuse what is a button and what is a link. So in my mind, a button is something that triggers a change. So it could update a page, it could open a modal, it could open a tab panel, for example. A link refreshes the page. It takes you to another place. Now, this is really, really important for everybody, but mostly it's important if you are blind and you are a screen reader. Because if you hear, a screen reader user, I should say, because if you hear the word button, you automatically know, subconsciously, something's going to change on the page. That's my expectation, unless it's a submit button. And if you hear link, I'm going to go to a new page. Also, you know to evoke different types of keyboard interaction to interact with the button or to interact with the link. So let's look at this page here. We have a banking website. Up on the top, we have what looks like a login button. It's a blue button with the word login written on it. Next, we have register, contact us, find a branch, search, which just look like a list of links in the navigation. Going into the main body of the page, we have 3 columns for 3 different types of mortgage. Each column at the bottom has what looks like a button: fixed rate mortgages, trackers, and offset mortgages. Now, looking at that page, how many buttons do you think there are? Anybody? Just shout out. 4? Okay, anything else? 0, 2, okay. Interesting. So the login button could go one of 2 ways. It could open a dialogue, but in this instance, it goes to a page. But it's styled to look like a button because it's a call to action, and that's okay. But it needs to be coded as a link. And if you're a designer or an interaction designer and that is your intent, you need to document that into your designs. You need to call that out, because otherwise the developer might not do that. Might code it as a button. Next, we have search, which looks like a link, but actually the behavior is it opens a panel. Therefore, it is a button, absolutely. Fixed rate mortgages, the mortgage buttons down there are in fact links, again, calls to action. So what you're thinking about here is the non-visual design. It's okay for it to look like a button if you're a sighted user, but for non-visual design, in the interaction design, you need to call that out. Otherwise, the developers might incorrectly code that as a button. Next, we have making things keyboard focusable. So here we have the wires for just a standard page with a button on the top right-hand corner. That could be login, it could be contact. If it opens a modal, then you say, this is a button, by the way, not this is a link. So you need to specify that in your designs. Next, we want to specify what the content order is. Where does that button sit in the priority order? Remember the inclusive design principles. Priority was one of them. So calling out the focus order, just in the wireframes, super easy, doesn't have to look pretty, just needs to tell the developer exactly what the content order is so they can get it right. You want that button prioritized. Next, we have focus management. So that button opens a modal, then you need to say, where does the focus go after that? Because if you're a sighted keyboard user or a screen reader user and you activate that button and a modal opens, you want your focus to go there. You don't want to be tabbing through the whole page before you get to the modal. Equally, once you're in there, focus needs to be constrained to within the modal until you dismiss it, either by the close button or the submit button. And then what happens? Where does it go? Where should the focus go after that? Back to the button that triggered it. This is one of the biggest things I see going wrong on the web. People lose their way once they start interacting with buttons. This is really important to call out because you want to be documenting it in your design so everybody knows and everyone's really clear what that button does and where it goes. And that can then be translated into developer requirements. Those designs and those annotations are so important because not only do they translate to developer requirements, they translate into your QA tests at the end of the project. They can then be fed in to your design patterns, your style guides, your libraries, everything. I cannot emphasize how important annotated designs are for collaborating and making buttons accessible. Has anybody heard of the way Aria authoring practices? Okay, a few people. If there's one thing you take away from my talk, please make it this. I will tweet it afterwards. It's a little bit of a kind of wall of text, but what it does is it describes the interaction design, the behavior, and the roles that should be assigned to components on the web. So you've got here button, breadcrumb, checkbox, modal dialogue. It tells you everything you need to do. So as an interaction designer or a designer, you don't need to know how to code this stuff. You don't need to write the requirements out. You just need to reference this document and say, by the way, this is a modal dialogue. Please code it like this. Because then you know the user experience is going to work for a keyboard-only user, a blind user, and so forth. So here we got the button stuff written down there. You don't need to know that, but the developers need to go and reference it. Digging around in design, the latest version of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines has added non-text to the requirement to make things have good color contrast. This, of course, includes a button. So you need to have a contrast ratio of at least, you want to comfortably exceed that, preferably, at least 3:1. And that, again, needs to be tested and signed off within the design. So here we have just an arrow button there. And that fails. We've got, this is the color contrast analyzer. There are multiple tools. I happen to use this one. And what you can do is you can pick the colors out, and it will tell you, you fail. You fail at small and large, and you fail for UI components. So then you can go and fix it. Another is use of color. Color is your friend. Color is such a benefit to accessibility. People tend to think, oh no, it's got to be black and white and it's got to be text. No. Color is great. It enables you to track progress if it's used in a positive way. It's you know, cognitively it's really good if you're doing focus states, etc. But don't use color alone to indicate if a button is selected. If you look at, this is Strava, I think, if you look at the bottom navigation, you can see that there is one button out of 5 that's selected because it's in orange. But if you're browsing in black and white, you lose that information, so you don't know where you are. Now, you could argue, but I know that I'm on Explore because it says Explore in the heading. But if you are a low vision user, you might have everything zoomed up. So you're not necessarily going to see the heading, but you don't know where you are when you look at the navigation. So use color in combination with other visible styles. Next, we have visible keyboard focus states. So, you know, everybody designs, pretty much everybody, not everyone, designs lovely hover states. But for whatever reason, we seem to forget to put this into focus states so that when you're navigating around with a keyboard, you can actually track where you are visually. I use keyboard a lot, and it drives me nuts when I can't see where I am on the page. So making sure you have focus and hover covered off in your designs, making sure that if you have a selected state, this looks different from your focus and hover state. Imagine if you have a main navigation, and this is more of a link, but you have the focus state on one link, and actually the link next to it is selected, but they both use the same styling, which is which. Content. So visible content, hidden content, and consistent editorial. Really, really important. I'm a big fan of icons, button icons with labels. I don't think people understand icons particularly well. Even the standard ones. My mother-in-law, first female president of ABC Sports in the States, very smart woman, has fibromyalgia, came to the web maybe 15 years ago, and she just can't do it. She cannot do it. She doesn't understand anything, any of the icons. So always having a visible label is helpful. So if you look here, we've got two buttons on the bottom right. Can you see them? Can anyone tell me what you think they might be? What do you think? Maybe the bottom one, like add to the list. Okay. Bottom one, maybe add to the list. Top one, whatever. So you need to have a label with it. So the top one is actually subscribe. Wow. I would never have guessed that. In fact, I might have used the plus for subscribe. And actually, the plus is bookmark, not add to the list. But I've seen plus used in other places as download. So you need to tell users what that button does. And yes, this is just basic usability. But this is something that can completely stop somebody who's disabled in their steps. Next, we have accessible name. So as a screen reader user, I want to be able to go onto that button and hear what it says. And this is a screenshot taken using VoiceOver on Mac. VoiceOver is a screen reader. It reads out everything on screen. And this little box here tells me what it's saying visually, and it says subscribe button. So I'm hearing subscribe, excellent, I know what it is. Button, I know what keyboard command to use it, and I know it's not going to refresh the page, and I'm going to stay where I am, hopefully, if it's been coded correctly. You know, all these things will be going through my head subconsciously. Consistency is also really, really key. So on the web, we have the subscribe and the bookmark button, and it's exactly the same on the iOS version. I worked on iPlayer when we did responsive and launched the first iOS and Android iPlayer apps. And one of my tasks that I took on was to make sure that we had consistent, accessible names across all the platforms, all three platforms. So as a screen reader user, I could go on to iOS or to Android, and it sounded familiar. Audible, audio branding, really, really important. So a lot of things go into making everything accessible for your buttons, but it's not going to remain so unless you have a really solid sign-off process. And I loved Felicity's point early about, yes, sign-off, but you can go and change it, because it might be that it doesn't work. It might be you've done some usability testing or whatever, but you have to have that step in the process. Because there's certain things that should never be tested by QA, ever. Color contrast is one of them. They shouldn't have to be testing if something has good color contrast, but they should be testing if the implementation is according to the requirements. Because even, I've seen it when a focus state was ever so slightly different on a different web page, it lost color contrast and it impacted that button across all the different templates. And it was a headache to go and rectify. So everything needs to be signed off. And doing this is not making buttons accessible is not like a production line. It doesn't go from, wireframing through to interaction design, through to content, through to development and QA. It's not like an ongoing production line for cars. It's a spectrum. Things can happen and things can impact and change it at all times, which is why that confluence process is so good. Also, documenting why you didn't have certain color combinations is very, very important. And I would actually go further to say, take it out of your documentation and put it into your pattern libraries and your style guides. And when you do, don't just add it, explain how that button changes dependent on context of use, because it might change dependent on the place. If it's in fact a link on the home page, as we saw in that banking app, it looks the same, but actually it behaves differently, and that's okay, but we need to explain that in the pattern library. So we all have a role to play in making our buttons accessible: interaction design, user experience and design, content, and developers. But really, ultimately, your users are the ones who are going to tell you, yep, that button is for me, or no, it doesn't work for me. I have a friend called Johnny who is quadriplegic. He's got a really good sense of humor, as you could see. He's sat back in his wheelchair laughing. He was at a conference with another friend of mine, and they were talking about, hey, what's the definition of done on an accessible whatever? And they were all, as Billy, my other friend, was saying, it's like, yeah, we're all trying to be really smart and kind of define how, what's the definition of done or an accessible template or whatever. And he turned around to Billy and said, well, how do we know when something is accessible? And Johnny just said, well, when I can use it, obviously, and then laughed at them. And I think that's the key takeaway as well, is if your users can't use it, then obviously, or your disabled users can't use it, then obviously it's broken. And all that I've gone through sort of in this talk, yes, ultimately it makes or breaks accessibility for somebody who might be disabled, but it actually enables everybody, regardless of your ability, to complete and understand and perceive things correctly when you're navigating the web. Thank you.